Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body question time. Question number 1, Graeme Pearson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body what developments there have been since November 2012 regarding the external screening facility.
David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The contractor's progress to date has included establishing the construction site, the temporary removal of parts of the glass roof over the concourse and wall panels, evacuating and laying the foundations and constructing the steel and concrete system frame. The project is on track and within budget. May I remind members that the decision to proceed with the project was not taken lightly and was based on the corporate body's corporate and legal responsibilities to ensure safety. The corporate body has a duty of care to all business users to put in place sufficient measures to the extent that it is reasonably practical in the circumstances to do so. Failure to carry out measures that are in law reasonably practical could leave the corporate body and its individual members open to prosecution. The external security facility will provide protection for over 400,000 visitors per year and up to 1,000 daily pass holders that include staff, members, media and contractors through a significantly safer and a more secure environment for screening.
Thank you. Graeme Pearson.
I thank the member for that response. The member will realise that members of this Parliament are sensitive in relation to the costs attached to such projects. Has the corporate body received an up-to-date threat assessment in relation to the situation for which this facility was designed, and are you able to share with the Parliament any details in connection with that assessment?
David Stewart.
Presiding Officer, the corporate body has received clear and consistent expert security advice that, in light of current threats, is highly advisable for the Parliament to construct an external security facility. While the member will understand more than most that I cannot go into detail of that advice, there are other indications, such as the number of incidents our own security team deal with. For example, over 1,500 sharp objects, such as knives, were retained in the public access area during 2012. The risk profile has changed from organised groups to obsessed individuals.
Thank you. Question number 2, Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Parliament Corporate Body whether it plans to upgrade the voting consoles in the Chamber, and if so, when will this be carried out?
Linda Fabiani.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The current sound and voting system was installed during summer recess of 2011, and it has a 10-year support and maintenance contract in place, so we have no current plans to upgrade.
Maureen Watt.
I thank Ms Fabiani for that answer. Ms Fabiani will recall that with the previous consoles, one could, by pressing a few buttons together, work out how many speakers were still in to speak in a particular debate, and therefore we could work out ourselves when to be back in for closing speeches, which I think is actually preferable than the presiding officer having to herd people back into the chamber for the final speeches. I wonder if it's possible to do that on these consoles, because I think it would be preferable.
Linda Fabiani.
That is certainly an interesting point, and I do remember that was the case with the last consoles. However, the agreement to upgrade these consoles and the specification to which they would be upgraded and what would be on the screens that we see was a decision taken by the last corporate body and presiding officers, and that is reflected in what we have here today. I have had it clarified that it's the wish of the presiding officers that should members want to know any of these things, they are more than welcome to send a note to the desk, and they will be given any information they require.
Question number 3, Kezia Dugdale.
To ask the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body what its position is on members paying their staff the living wage.
Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The SPCB is highly supportive of the principles of the living wage, and as an employer of parliamentary service staff, we lead by example in paying above the living wage for all parliamentary staff. In respect of members' staff, the position is that the employment relationship is directly between the member and their member of staff. The rate of pay is therefore a matter for each individual member to determine.
Kezia Dugdale.
The member will be aware that I've brought the issue up of the living wage before at corporate body time, particularly with regards to contract staff in the Parliament building. I wonder if he could possibly update us on progress in that regard and whether that work applies to members' offices. I'm sure he would appreciate that it would be good practice for all members to pay their staff the living wage.
Liam McArthur.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Not only do I recognise the lead that Kezia Dugdale has taken on this issue, I also recall that she secured a debate on this issue during Living Wage Week and due to laryngitis had to have John Park step into her shoes, but I'm glad she's refound her voice to continue her campaign on this issue. I think in relation to the contract staff in the Parliament, we're aware that there are particular issues in relation to catering and cleaning staff. We continue to have discussions with the contractors over that to ensure that we're applying what pressure we can within the limits that apply through procurement. I think in relation to member staff, I think, as I said, as a parliamentary corporate body, we've taken a very strong lead on this issue. We hope that does indeed set an example for MSPs, but I think all of us probably have a role to play in exerting pressure on our colleagues to ensure that they are paying the living wage to each member of their staff.
A supplementary from Chick Brodie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, there is a very large facilities management company that does work, I know, for some of the Ayrshire councils. Its revenues last year were £2 billion. The corporation tax it paid was 1.1% against the standard corporation tax of 23%. Will the SPCB ensure that full due diligence is done on all companies that we deal with so that they comply with corporate tax requirements?
I'm not convinced that actually ties in with Kezia Dugdale's question. Mr McArthur, do you want to make any comment?
Deputy Presiding Officer, I'll try to be helpful. I mean, certainly it's an issue that's been raised by a number of members in the past. I think there are limits to what we as a corporate body can do in terms of the tax arrangement that individual companies may seek to organise their affairs through. But nevertheless, I would, I think, try to reassure the Chamber that we do exert a very thorough due diligence in any of those contractual arrangements before signing any contract.
Can I just clarify, John Wilson has his button pressed at the moment. Is that for a supplementary on this question? John Wilson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's to ask the corporate body if they monitor how many interns are recruited at any one time within the Parliament.
Liam McArthur.
I mean, certainly we will have a very clear figure of the number of interns that the Parliament has in terms of our own staff and departments. I think in terms of MSPs interns, that is perhaps slightly more difficult to get an accurate figure on. But certainly I'm happy to liaise with John Wilson on how we maybe capture that and see what information kind of flows from it. But again, I would go back to the point I made in response to Kezia Dugdale earlier. The staffing arrangements between individual members and their staff is really a matter for MSPs.
Question number 4, John Wilson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body, how many oral questions have been A, asked, lodged for, and B, taken at SPCB Questions in the current Parliamentary Session?
Liam McArthur. And can I ask other members if they wouldn't mind stopping conversations in the Chamber? Liam McArthur.
Thank you very much. Including the 6 questions lodged for answer today, 32 oral questions to the SPCB have been lodged in the current parliamentary session. 20 of the 26 questions lodged prior to today have been taken at SPCB question time, with the remaining 6 having received written answers.
John Wilson.
Presiding Officer, I thank the corporate body for that response, and it's just to ask the question whether or not the corporate body would consider trying to either increase the number of sessions where corporate body questions can be raised, or extend the period in which corporate body questions can be raised in the Parliament.
Liam McArthur.
Well, can I first pay tribute to John Wilson's recognition of corporate body questions being one of the unheralded success stories of the Parliament. I'm sure they have the backing of many members in that. I think in terms of the frequencies of question time, that's really a matter for the Bureau, and I think there's perhaps a legitimate discussion to be had in the Bureau about whether or not the number of sessions we have is currently adequate. In terms of the length of time for those questions, those are set out in standing orders and are limited to 15 minutes, although I note from the last session we had in November there were 10 questions lodged and a number of supplementaries, I think principally in relation to IT issues, and that the session ran on to 23 minutes on that occasion. Clearly the presiding officer that day got caught up in the excitement of it all. Nevertheless, I think the 3 to 4 sessions we have over the course of a year has been the norm since the establishment of the Parliament. It's perhaps worth the Bureau looking at whether or not that's adequate. But in terms of the number of questions that are lodged for oral questions, but also the written questions that's lodged, I'm not sure there's yet a compelling case that there's an unmet demand in terms of additional sessions.
Question number 5, Mark McDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body what work is being done to improve accessibility to the parliamentary campus for people with autistic spectrum disorder.
David Stewart.
The corporate body is committed to an ongoing programme of continuous improvement for accessibility and makes every effort to involve groups of disabled people in identifying where improvements can be made within the parliamentary campus. Recently, we've been working with Autism Initiatives UK and the National Autistic Society to enable us to respond positively to the needs of people with autism who visit the parliamentary building. For example, with Autism Initiatives UK, we've developed a training programme that is aimed at our public-facing staff. This will help them gain a better understanding of the needs of people with autism and how best to respond to their individual needs.
Mark McDonald.
I thank the member for that answer. The member may be aware of the National Autistic Society's accreditation process, which was achieved in 2012 by the Northern Irish Assembly. This involved, for example, changes being made to the building, for example, a quiet room, looking at signage and also placing, for example, warning signs on things like noisy hand dryers. It also involved training to frontline staff involving the creation of autism champions. And I wonder if the member could advise whether the Parliamentary Corporate Body is looking at how it can work towards achieving accreditation for this establishment as well.
David Stewart.
Presiding Officer, I'm very grateful for Mr McDonald raising this issue with us. An initial meeting has taken place with the National Autistic Society, and we're now exploring this further with the relevant business areas across the Parliament to identify whether we're meeting the needs of people with autism and where further development would be beneficial. We also intend to make contact with the officer at the Northern Ireland Assembly who has led the process for the Autism Access Award to find out how this worked for the Assembly. We will update the member once further progress has been made.
Question number 6, Alison Johnston.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body what recent discussions it has had with its catering contractor regarding the traceability of its meat supply chain.
Linda Fabiani.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There have certainly been a few recent discussions with our catering contractor, who has assured us that all meat products served at the Parliament have full traceability and are either Red Tractor or Quality Meat Scotland certified. This is a certification which requires the meat product to be fully audited from the source to the plate.
Alison Johnson.
Thank you. The Soil Association's Food for Life catering mark provides independent association on traceability and quality, not just of meat, but of all food groups. And already 1 in 10 schools in Scotland hold the mark, and kitchens in Edinburgh Council, NHS Lothian and Edinburgh University are working towards knowing where all their food comes from. Will the SPCB consider requiring the Parliament's catering contractor to work towards achieving this Soil Association quality mark and join in this good work, which looks to improve food quality, localise our food and strengthen our local economy? Thank you.
Linda Fabiani.
Certainly, currently, our catering contract requires food standards to comply with certain assurance schemes that include animal welfare, such as I mentioned, Red Tractor and Quality Meat Scotland. And then there's our SPCA Freedom Food. I am interested in what Alison Johnson has said to us today. And yes, we can ask that it be looked into, that for future contracts which go out to tender, it may be worthwhile to look at whether this is something else we should consider.
Thank you very much. And that concludes Parliamentary Corporate Body question time. And I will allow a moment or two for members to change places before I call the next item of business. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 5838 in the name of Alex Neil on the integration of adult health and social care. And before we start, can I remind members to speak through the chair by referring to other members by their full names and not as you. Thank you very much. I now call on Alex Neil to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, you have 13 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. Hopefully today's debate will be slightly more consensual than yesterday's debate, but one never knows. I'm very pleased to be moving my motion, which I duly do, to open this debate on integrating adult health and social care in Scotland. We'll introduce a bill to Parliament in this important area of public service reform by the end of this parliamentary session. During this debate, I will restate our commitment to integration and outline our priorities for the bill. I will start by thanking partner organisations in health and local government, stakeholders across the professional organisations, the third and independent sectors, patients, service user, carer and staff representatives for their contribution, as well as the Parliament's Health and Sport Committee for their contribution in what has been a very productive period leading up to where we are. Presiding Officer, it's been clear to me since becoming Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing that the Scottish Government is by no means alone in recognising that as society's needs change, so too must the nature and form of public services. It is also abundantly clear to me that successful delivery of integrated health and social care services depends on effective partnership working across both the statutory and the non-statutory sectors, and getting this right is a priority for Scottish society as a whole, requiring leadership, engagement and involvement across the health and social care landscape. I was pleased to receive 315 written responses to last year's consultation, which have added very considerably to our collective stock of thinking on this matter. As part of the consultation process last summer, the Scottish Government ran 9 public and practitioner events, which approximately 900 people attended. My officials heard from health and social care professionals, from statutory and non-statutory organisations, carers, users of health and social care services and members of the public more widely at these events, and all of their contributions were immensely valuable. On top of that, my officials were involved in around 50 local events, including focus groups, local forums and seminars. In total, around 2,000 people were directly involved in these discussions. That shows you two things: that we have gone to some lengths to ensure the matter is thoroughly consulted upon, and secondly, that the challenges under discussion really are important and matter very much to many people in Scotland. Following the consultation, we have published an analytical report reflecting the consultation responses, and our response to the consultation responses have also been published. The approach here is consistent with our priority to continue the invaluable ongoing partnership work between the National Health Service in Scotland, local government, the third and independent sectors and professional bodies, including allied health professionals. We are committing to ensuring that effective integration is informed by the knowledge and experience of those in the public sector and beyond who have a key interest in health and social care. We must continue to work together to make sure that public services evolve effectively so that people receive the support they need, both quantitatively and qualitatively, and that we use all our resources to best effect to achieve the best possible outcomes. That is why integration of adult health and social care is a key part of the Scottish Government's commitment to public service reform in Scotland, and why what we achieve with this programme of reform matters so much. What do I mean when I refer to the changing shape of Scottish society? The 2011 census shows us that for the first time there are more people aged over 65 in Scotland than there are people under 15. It's great that more people are living longer and healthier lives, but for us, as for the rest of the developed world, an ageing population does mean that we must look carefully at how we plan and deliver services. And recent research shows that 1/5 of all girls born in Scotland today will live until they're 100. And as well as the ageing of the population, Presiding Officer, we also have had the increase to record numbers in the population of Scotland. A welcome development, but one that presents another challenge that we need to rise up to. But it's more than just about older people and longevity. It's about improving outcomes for people who have a range of complex support needs and for their carers and families as well. Too often in these circumstances, people are admitted to hospital or to a care home when a package of care and support in the community could deliver better outcomes for them and would be more their choice. When that happens, the costs are human and financial, and the consequences are not just personal. They're felt across the whole system and by other people as resources are tied up inappropriately in care that's not best suited for the individual. It's about putting the leadership of clinicians and care professionals at the heart of service delivery for people with health and social care needs. Perhaps most ambitiously, it's about establishing a public service landscape in which different public bodies are required to work together and with their partners in the third and independent sectors, removing unhelpful boundaries and using their combined resources to achieve maximum benefit for patients, service users, carers and families. West Lothian, as with other areas in Scotland, have developed their universal reablement service, which responds to all hospital discharges where needed. Staff come from different agencies and organisations, but work in an integrated way to deliver what is a truly personalised service for the individual. Early indications are that this service has saved West Lothian over 800 care hours per week and resulted in individuals being able to complete everyday tasks for themselves again. This is a very good example of health and social care partnership working with leadership, engagement and involvement in action. It was in many ways no surprise to me that the response to the consultation was so thoughtful and thorough. We have an excellent record of partnership working over many years in Scotland. Nevertheless, we all recognise that our current system of health and social care still incorporates within it barriers in terms of structures, professional territories, silos, governance arrangements and financial management. Often these have no helpful bearing on the needs of the large, growing group of service users, many of whom have multiple health and social care needs, and in many cases these barriers work against general aspirations of efficiency and clinical and care quality. A forthcoming bill will reform the system to enable delivery of care that's better joined up within health and between health and social care, and as a consequence delivers better outcomes, as I've said. If you look at NHS, another example, NHS Lanarkshire's Hospital to Home programme, a very good example of joined up working between health boards and local authorities, enabling more people to be treated in their local community. A project there which involves a team of nurses, allied health professionals, healthcare support workers, social care staff, GPs and consultants caring for patients at home, is to be adapted for use and rolled out across Scotland. This has enabled 80% of patients to stay in their own home rather than being admitted to hospital, an example of what integration can achieve. The bill will start from the principle of person-centred care, focusing on the importance of prevention and anticipation. This is in line with our ambitions as Government for community planning and for reform of children's services, and recognises the findings of the Christie Commission. It's also based on the wealth of evidence that tells us that a person-centred approach delivers the best outcomes. The starting principle of the bill will be a requirement in health boards and local authorities to deliver jointly a set of nationally agreed outcomes focused on improving the individual's experience of care. We will remove community health partnerships from the statute book and establish in their place health and social care partnerships to provide an environment of joint governance, joint accountability and integrated oversight of service delivery. Each health and social care partnership will be accountable to its Council and Health Board for the delivery of the nationally agreed outcomes and any other appropriate outcomes agreed locally using the integrated budget covering adult social care, community health care and aspects of secondary health care. The legislation will require health boards and local authorities to integrate these services, but will leave it to local agreement to decide whether to include children's services within the scope of this partnership. But the proposals will allow for the range of areas of service provision for integration to be agreed locally. There are two possible models of integration agreed with COSLA. One is very similar to the Highland model, which is a single agency model, and the other one is the corporate model, involving the partnership between the Health Board and the Council, with the joint accountable officer in charge of the day-to-day running of the partnership. We believe that's the most effective way to ensure that our objectives are met by this legislation. But it's also very important that we involve totally other key stakeholders, the patients, the end users, the third sector, the independent sector and others, to ensure that in every area the design and architecture as well as the delivery of services is up to the standard that we demand. Presiding Officer, this is a revolution in the delivery of health and social care in Scotland. It is a very positive, radical step to improve both the quality and quantity of service provision throughout health and social care. We believe this is a major step forward, and we look forward, in cooperation with others in the Chamber, to take this legislation through to the statute book. But my message and I spoke at the COSLA conference this morning, my loud and clear message to every health board in Scotland, to every council in Scotland, as well as to all the other stakeholders, is there is no need to wait for the legislation to pass to get moving. Already many parts of Scotland have got their foot on the accelerator. We must encourage everybody to move in this as quickly as possible, get these partnerships established, and most importantly of all, make sure we are delivering the quality of provision that our people deserve throughout the country. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Can I just make it clear there is some time available at this point for interventions, and I call Jackie Bailey to speak to and move Amendment 5838.1 around 9 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. In what has been a very busy time for the respective health teams, I am very pleased to bring the parliamentary week to a close, debating the integration of health and social care. I don't think there is a more pressing social policy concern than the care of our older people. Nobody, I think, in this chamber doubts the scale of the demographic challenge we face, whether it's the 40% increase in those aged 65 to 74 in the next 20 years, and as I look around, that's many of the people in this room, or the staggering 83% increase in those over 75. Scotland's population is getting older and people are living longer. And I was thinking earlier about the Cabinet Secretary's comments about a girl born today is likely to live to 100. It does strike me that the Cabinet Secretary is going to see a lot of me for an awful long time on the basis of those statistics. But whilst it's a cause for celebration, it raises challenges. Experts suggest that we would need 6,000 more beds in the NHS, and the health budget would need to double to simply stand still if we're going to meet the likely demand. So doing nothing is clearly not an option. Our aim must be to provide the very best quality health and social care to enable people to live their lives in their local community, enriched by family and friends. And Scottish Labour set out our policy intentions almost 3 years ago and followed that up with an expert group chaired by Sir John Arbuthnot and drawing in members with expertise in health and social care. Their work has helped to shape this agenda, and I thank them for that. We recognised at the time that older people were falling through the gaps in services. They were ending up in emergency care because of a lack of integration on the ground. And whilst we might all in this chamber talk the language of prevention, all the assessment frameworks used predominantly by local government have to prioritise those in most need and ration services. And of course there remains a postcode lottery in care, cost shunted between different public organisations and differential charging regimes. So our vision of the future is for integrated services, locally delivered, locally accountable, based on radically reformed community health partnerships, involving GPs much more in the design and commissioning of services, and with a national framework that ends the postcode lottery of care, driving up standards, delivering better quality care with much better outcomes for older people. And of course, one budget to stop health and local government playing pass the parcel with people's care. A charter setting out what you would expect in terms of outcome, equity and quality. Happy to give way.
Mark McDonald.
The member says that the Labour vision is to create much more integrated services at a local level. I wonder how she squares that with the decision by her colleagues in Aberdeen City Council to establish a local authority trading company for social care, which the Chief Executive of NHS, Graeme Pearson, says will put at risk some of the benefits that could be realised from integration of health and social care.
Jackie Bailey.
I have to say that when you squeeze the funding for local government so that you as the SNP government pass on 83% of all the cuts you receive, it's no wonder local authorities have to be creative to continue providing lifeline services to their communities. But you know, at the time of our last debate, it was a different Cabinet Secretary. Her approach was remarkably similar to ours, and at the time I made reference to imitation being the sincerest form of flattery. I have to confess I was slightly disappointed at the consultation document and disappointed at the government's response. It was light on vision and ambition. It was all about structures and governance. The focus on older people and adults appeared to be a secondary consideration in the tussle for control. But in short, although it is a regrettably pale imitation of the early ambition of the government, we will work with the government to try and get this right. And I do welcome the Cabinet Secretary's comments today about the principles and the vision that will underlie the bill. And that, indeed, is something that was worth hearing. The stakes couldn't be higher. I do think we need a radical vision about how to achieve integration and not backroom deals that balance competing interests. If we start from what we need to achieve for the service user and their carers, and then design the service around that, we are much more likely to get it right. Before I return to governance, there is a key issue that I hope the Cabinet Secretary and the Scottish Government will really consider, and it is this. The culture of the NHS and local government is very different. On the one hand, the NHS assesses people based on need and then provides treatment free of charge. In local government, need is also assessed, but then priorities are determined, services are rationed, and people are required in many cases to contribute financially. How are we going to bring those two competing cultures together? Equally, we have a number of services outsourced to the private sector, for example, home care. Will this use of the private sector continue in the way it currently is? Will it in some way spread? How and from which sectors will you commission services? These are key and fundamental questions that the government need to consider and discuss with Parliament. The model of governance suggested by the government concedes the fact that there should be more elected representatives on the board, and that is welcome, but that this should be balanced by health board members. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to be even more radical? Because I think virtually every submission we've received asks for representation and voting rights on the board. And I am sympathetic to many of them, as I'm sure he is. If you take the allied health professionals, OTs, physiotherapists and others as an example, many of them are the bridge between health and social care services. They help in very practical ways to sustain people in their own homes. And of course, they should have a voice and a seat at the table. Or for that matter, the myriad of voluntary sector organisations that operate at a community level, building capacity as well as providing services. They too should have a voice and a seat at the table. But it will become an incredibly crowded table, and not at this point. All too often, it is the voluntary sector that is the glue between health and social care, many of them operating at a neighbourhood level in a way that other services find difficult to do. I'm a fan, but not because I have some kind of romantic notion of what they do. I know we get added value when they deliver services. We get a bigger bang for our buck. And I know that in very many cases, the quality of the services delivered are second to none. So let's make sure they have a key role in integration. But I want to make a distinction between local authorities and health boards that might chime with the experience of many members in this chamber. Because in my 13 years as an MSP, I have found health boards to be wholly unaccountable to everyone other than the Cabinet Secretary, and I think he would concede even then there are challenges. I have watched executive directors, employees of the health board, engaged in payroll votes when it really doesn't matter what the issue under discussion is, because all the hands go up simply to follow the needs of the chief executive. And whilst I'm talking about officers, we really don't need another set of accountable officers. We already have them in local government and health. Is there really genuinely a need for more institutional clutter and confusion? Happy to give way.
Bob Doris.
Thank Jackie Bailey for giving way. I appreciate some of this matters she said about the voluntary sector, but in terms of local authorities and health boards working together, I've found that local authorities tend to be worse sometimes because they get very politically defensive, unlike health boards. But would you accept that health and social care integration, the key strength is a single accountable officer who is equally accountable to both the health board and the local authority, so there is absolutely no passing the buck?
Jackie Bailey.
Well, I have more faith in local authorities than you do, and I will come on in my speech to develop how I think that accountability is best deployed, because I do want the new health and social care body to be accountable and to be answerable to the people of the area. We live in a democracy, thankfully. We elect councillors to deal with matters in our local communities. They have a wealth of knowledge and experience, and they are tenacious in representing their local communities, and I believe that they should be in charge. The model operated by local government allows for officers, allows for expert advisers to influence and shape the agenda, to have their seat at the table, to provide the essential professional input that is so essential to good decision-making. It's a model that works. And I would invite Bob Doris to think about that. What's wrong with that? Because on the day that Councillor David O'Neill, President of COSLA, set out his vision for further devolution of powers to local government, let me encourage the Cabinet Secretary to be radical. This shouldn't be a debate about who holds the balance of power. It should be a debate about the best vehicle for delivery. Democratic accountability in the NHS may be an alien creature, but you know it's alive and well in local government and is such a driver for change. I trust councillors, does the Cabinet Secretary.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank the member for taking an intervention, because I'm genuinely interested to know, for clarification, is she suggesting that the councils alone should run these partnerships, and that the council should take over the work of health boards?
Jackie
No.
Bailey.
What I'm very clear about is that this is a partnership, but I want to bring democratic accountability to that partnership. Increasingly, what we're talking about is ensuring that there are services that are effectively knitted together and delivered on the ground. I want to see councillors very much as that democratic accountability. But if you look at the local government model, it involves professionals from across the sector and is a way of including the voluntary sector, allied health professionals, health, the whole working partnership that is there. So I think there is merit in that, and I hope the Cabinet Secretary will consider that. On finance, I see the Cabinet Secretary as retaining an annual focus of tension, agreeing the budget. But, if the two don't agree, don't worry, he will have the powers to force them to do so. Now, that, frankly, sounds like a recipe for more bean counters rather than a focus on older people or adults. A more radical alternative would be to allocate the money centrally, using an Arbuthnot-type formula which recognises need in much the same way as the Scottish Government already do for health boards. Unfortunately, it doesn't filter beyond health boards. If it works for health boards, though, why can't it work for integrated health and social care bodies? And whilst we're on the subject of money, Presiding Officer, local government is woefully underfunded for social care. I've said earlier the SNP passed on 83% of all the cuts made to local government. Is it any wonder, then, that their costs of care rises and people are being charged different rates, different eligibility criteria in different neighbouring areas? The SNP need to ensure that there are adequate resources for local government to meet their responsibilities, or you will destine the integration of health and social care to the worst possible start. In coming to a conclusion, Presiding Officer, the government also need to consider the impact of welfare reform. Many people currently in receipt of DLA use this to pay for services. If they fail to qualify for a personal independence payments, there will be a black hole, and I have asked the Government many times to address this. Presiding Officer, matters are pressing. We on these benches will help to deliver a fair and robust system of health and social care, but the Scottish Government need to do more. They need to be more ambitious, more visionary. The Cabinet Secretary spoke about a revolution. I look forward to seeing it.
Thank you very much. Could you move your amendment?
Move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. I now call on Nanette Milne, 7 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome this debate as another milestone along the journey to achieving better integration of adult health and social care, and I look forward to seeing the Government's legislative proposals to assist in the process once the bill is presented to Parliament in the near future. From the evidence taken by the Health and Sport Committee ahead of the Government's consultation, from the responses to the consultation and from the Government's response to that, there is a unanimous view that the focus has to be on achieving better outcomes for people who require health and social care services by improving the quality and the consistency of the care which they receive, to support them in their daily lives and to enable them to live as full a life as possible within their capabilities, whatever their age. Whilst the proposed legislation will be restricted to the integration of health and social care for adults, there was a demand from those responding to the consultation that the legislation be extended to children's services and to a broader range of services such as housing provision. The Government justifies its stance by stating its belief that health boards and councils are best placed to make decisions on service integration for children, and we have already seen this in Highland, where the NHS is now providing services for adults and the Council is looking after children's services. With regard to other services, the Government feels that as many joint and collaborative partnerships already work well and can be left to local partners to work out, they see no need to legislate for the integration of services like housing, where there is an immediate need to address the health and social care needs of people with multiple support needs. And I agree with that, because very often these people don't get the joined-up care which they need to keep them safe and well in their own homes for as long as possible. It's important to note, as has been pointed out in one of our briefing papers, that by proactively embracing the role of housing in developing integrated housing and care services, both central government and local authorities could make substantial savings in the long run without compromising on quality. I think this is a fair point, given the demographics of an increasing number of elderly people with multiple physical problems and increasingly complex care needs, which will inevitably lead to a growing demand during the next decade for very sheltered housing and for extra care housing. There is broad support for the Government's proposals to base its reforms on nationally agreed outcomes with locally determined priorities, because local circumstances do vary quite widely and must be considered when planning integrated local services. Circumstances can change too over time, and so to be meaningful, I think there must be scope for both nationally agreed outcomes and local priorities to evolve, always assuming that the focus will continue to be on the well-being and independence of service users, giving them control over their own lives. One of the barriers to integration, and it's been hinted at this afternoon, has been the cultural differences between health professionals and social workers, illustrated by segregated training and rivalries between the two groups, together with a perception of medical dominance. If integration is to proceed successfully, these ingrained organisational cultures need to be overcome. And the Government does believe that by placing a statutory authority on health boards and local authorities to work together, and in collaboration with key stakeholders, these competing rivalries and difficulties can be overcome. I hope indeed that that's the case, because I don't see that integrated health and social care will work without such a cultural change. The consultees feel nonetheless that there should be a mechanism in place to resolve disputes should they arise. As regards the composition of the health and social care partnerships and the Government's proposal to legislate for HSCPs to include a single health board and one local authority, there was some demand for partnerships to include more than one council where appropriate. The BMA, for instance, feels that this facility must be in place if integration is to be successful, because... Yes, sir.
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank the member for taking the intervention? Can I say she makes a very fair point about where there is a desire for the partnership to cover more than one local authority area. I intend to make provision in the bill that where there's a desire locally and agreement for that to happen, then it will be able to be achieved. I mean, we've got areas where there are 3 local authorities within, say, one health board area. If the 3 local authorities and the health board agree that they should have 1 partnership instead of 3, the bill will allow that to happen.
Nanette Milne. Cabinet Secretary has taken a paragraph out of my speech. I'll still say it. The BMA does feel this facility must be in place, as I say, if integration is successful, because of the current lack of co-terminosity in some areas where health boards, as we know, cover more than one local authority. They give, as an example, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. That area. But the same applies in my region, where NHS Grampian covers Aberdeen City, Aberdeenshire and Murray Council areas. So the Government's decision to allow in the legislation for ministers to consider applications where more than one council wishes to join a partnership is to be welcomed and would allow for any future changes in health board or local authority boundaries. It's proposed that legislation will allow voting rights only to statutory members of LHCP committees and for councils and health boards to have parity of voting power. That's fine, but some consultees were unhappy with these proposals, with the Health and Social Care Alliance and third sector organisations putting forward a case for service users and carer representatives to be voting members as well. I feel this is an issue which can be probed further, perhaps, when the bill comes before committee, and I have no doubt that we will receive further representations at that point. Legislation will also ensure that health and social care partnerships are accountable to full councils and health boards, not just to council leaders and board chairmen, and I think that should satisfy a number of concerns. The final issue I wish to touch on is the committee membership of HSCPs, a matter which is of significant concern to the BMA and the clinicians it represents, particularly GPs, who have an enormous role to play in ensuring proper integrated care for patients. The BMA feels that the membership of the HSCP committees, as set out in the consultation, is significantly management-orientated, and its membership would welcome a stronger role for doctors appointed to positions in these committees. It was because CHPs were largely management-run and bureaucratic that GPs and consultants shied away from them. And I actually recall my GP husband saying they were too large and too management-focused to make primary care professionals feel that their contribution would be heeded and valued. So I think that is a point. And I think that is an issue which really has to be addressed if the new HSCPs are going to get the support from clinicians, which is very, very important to the success of integration. So I will conclude, Presiding Officer. I'm content with the general principles underlying the Government's motion for this debate as a foundation on which the forthcoming legislation will be built, and I do look forward to seeing how they're translated into the bill, which will soon be introduced to Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the open debate. Speeches of 6 minutes with a bit of time in hand at the moment for interventions. Can I remind members who wish to participate in the debate that they must press the request to speak buttons, please, and I call on Aileen MacLeod to be followed by Jane Baxter.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the opportunity to speak in this afternoon's debate on an area of policy which I believe is going to be of real importance to the way in which we deliver health and social care in the future. And I also look forward to the detailed scrutiny of the bill by this Parliament, particularly as a member of the Health Committee. Now, the Cabinet Secretary has already outlined some of the demographic challenges that face Scotland, and there are areas of the country, such as Dumfries and Galloway, where, as we know, the demographic trends towards a rising population of older people and a falling population of people of working age and children are already outstripping the national figures. When combined with the challenges of delivering high-quality health and social care in a largely rural environment with many remote settlements, it is clear that change in the way in which we plan and deliver care is needed. Of course, this isn't only about delivering integrated care for our older people, although that is a very worthy prize. Integration will also bring benefits for adults with multiple or complex conditions, as well as those for living with long-term conditions. A system which has become very complicated and sometimes disjointed needs to be fully integrated, with the needs of the patient put first, rather than concerns over operational or corporate demarcation lines. And I think it's fair to emphasise that professionals dealing with frontline care are already trying to integrate as much as they can. Presiding Officer, I recently visited Kirkcudbright Community Hospital, where the GP surgery and community hospital occupy a single building. The hospital primarily deals with discharges from the Regional General Hospital in Dumfries, and the local GPs, who are often the patient's own family doctors, work closely with social services to smooth the transition from hospital back home and to put in place any ongoing support that may be required. To me, that is integration working already. And last week, I also visited the Galloway Community Hospital in Stranraer, an altogether larger facility. Both have renal units enabling patients to benefit from the 3 sessions of dialysis they need every week, without the very lengthy journeys that they previously had to make to Dumfries. Both are also providing services that match the specific needs and priorities of the local communities that they serve. Delivering services closest to where people need them will, in my view, be crucial to the success of integration. And I was struck on both visits by the enthusiasm of NHS staff and GPs have for this policy. It is a logical extension of the clinical practices I've just described. In Dumfries and Galloway, therefore, Presiding Officer, I believe there are already firm foundations, and the forthcoming bill is intended to build on those firm foundations and strengthen good practice by empowering frontline staff to deliver the better health outcomes that we're seeking. Presiding Officer, at the heart of this policy must be prevention and anticipation. Integration is as much about helping to avoid people being admitted to hospital as it is about managing their return home. And the Christie Commission demonstrated that while everyone understood the importance of preventative spending, we had not as a country come to grips with the changes that agenda demands. And the Government has been clear that the approach to legislation will be permissive rather than restrictive, enabling organisations to work together to take down barriers and build on the good practice that already exists. And in my view, that collaborative approach must include the third and independent sectors in the design and planning of services. Presiding Officer, I know that this morning Dumfries and Galloway's Community Health and Social Care Partnership Board took important decisions to move the integration agenda forward for the region. The willingness to embrace integration, which I've seen in the front line, is shared by senior management and elected members in both the Dumfries and Galloway Council and the local NHS. Amongst those decisions is the inclusion of representatives of the third sector and independent sector on the project board, which will take forward the detailed work on integration. And I believe that the participation of the third and independent sectors in the development and implementation of integration is important. Both are delivery partners with the public sector and a source of experience and expertise that will add materially to the quality of the eventual outcome. And I hope that the bill will make clear the role the third and independent sectors will play in shaping the whole process. In closing, Presiding Officer, I believe this is an exciting and important policy which has the capacity to dramatically improve the way in which we provide adult health and social care. It has the potential to deliver meaningful preventative measures and support older people and those with complex or multiple conditions to live well in their own homes. And while I accept there will be challenges ahead in delivering such an ambitious agenda, I also believe that by working together locally, nationally, professionally and politically will enable us to improve the health and well-being of our nation, and in doing so to help tackle the health inequalities within our own local communities. I therefore support the Government's motion this afternoon, tabled by Alex Neil.
Thank you very much. I now call Jane Baxter to be followed by Gil Patterson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I should begin by declaring an interest, as I am an elected member of Fife Council, where the Cabinet Secretary will be pleased to hear we've had a health and social care partnership for a number of years, which is already delivering a number of co-located and coordinated services for the benefit of the people of Fife.
Excuse me, sorry, would you be able to move your microphone round slightly?
Okay. Is that better?
Directional, that's great, thank you.
Okay, that's great, thanks. So the integration of health and social care services is a priority for the Scottish Labour Party and has been for some time. And although opinions will vary across the Chamber about how this integration will work, I am pleased that we are here to discuss a principle we all believe in. And I hope that today's debate will be constructive I hope that the Minister will listen to what is said and that we can work together to bring forward legislation that we can all be proud of and that will really deliver for Scottish people on the ground. For what is this debate about if it's not about the power of working together to deliver meaningful outcomes? So it's crucial that this legislation goes beyond the headline, beyond the superficial and the superstructure. It has to deliver long-term and fundamental change. And when we talk about change, we have to recognise that we're not only talking about organisational change, but also an enormous change in the culture of the delivery of health and social care services. Delivery of care should not be a tug-of-war between health boards and councils, and the current proposals will simply not address this issue. Integration goes beyond cooperation and coordination of autonomous bodies. True integration is about the softening of boundaries and the emergence of a new work unit. This is only possible when we recognise how tensions arise and where boundaries become lines of defence. The lines of accountability need to be local and clear, and I believe that leaves local authorities well placed to have a lead role over health and social care partnerships. The Cabinet Secretary already monitors local authority delivery of single outcome agreements, and there should be a continuing role for Healthcare Improvement Scotland and the Care Inspectorate. Health boards and councils face increasingly difficult financial conditions, which have got to be addressed prior to legislation. And given that a budget, by its very nature, places limits on any service, it is essential that as part of an integrated care service, all parties work together to solve local problems and we ensure the right framework is in place to allow them to do so as equal partners. The proposals as they stand will inevitably create tensions and pressures between health boards and local councils. And we've seen examples of this in Fife, with unseemly, undignified arguments between the Health Board and the Council about who should fund the care places which will free up hospital beds. And that's why we support direct Scottish Government funding for health and social care partnerships. For the needs of service users should be at the core of this reorganisation. We have to start with the service user and work upwards to provide a framework that supports them best. My worry with the proposals as they stand is that too much focus has been spent formulating a superstructure at the macro level and not enough on the individual user's needs, which have serious implications for delivery at the service level. People need accountable, clear and truly integrated care services. They need responsive services where the professionals who support them work together to build local networks, knowledge and continuity of care. And it's critical that through integration, the emphasis is on health and well-being, not sickness. Most health care is delivered outside the hospital setting, and I'm pleased, therefore, that the proposals provide scope for local partners to ensure we approach health and care holistically, recognising that it's not just about acute services and treatment, but about life circumstances, prevention and early intervention. And that, in addition to broadening out integration to all adults and into other groups, the proposals also allow local partners to ensure policy areas such as housing and transport are part of the bigger picture. I hope we can ensure such holistic thinking is part of the new culture of care. The time of compartmentalised service provision has got to end, and I know that this will take years, beyond our tenure here, but it is important that we get the legislative framework right now. GPs, third sector organisations, allied health professionals, frontline staff and patients and service users must be part of the decision-making for integration to work, and decision-making must be clear and coherent. And beyond making sure we get the structural aspects of integration right, the difficulty of merging cultures is one that lingers. It will take strong leadership and a secure framework that provides the right environment to engender a new work culture. And I'm just not convinced that the current proposals will deliver this for the Scottish people. And I repeat my hope that we can work with the Government to improve the legislation. So whilst I have concerns regarding the current proposals, I remain hopeful that we can get this right. We have an opportunity to offer the Scottish people true integration, properly and constructively financed, clearly managed and fully accountable at local level. I hope we take it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we move on, can I just say to the Chamber, I'm not very keen to interrupt members' speeches, so if everyone who's speaking in the debate could ensure their microphones are pointing in the right direction, I'd be most grateful. I call Gill Patterson to be followed by Duncan McNeill.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. It seems that this week has been a health week in the Parliament with the debate yesterday. I think that's a good thing. It's a very important matter I would like to see this happening more frequently, and maybe annually we could have it on the calendar. And of course, as a member of the Health and Sports Committee, I welcome the opportunity to speak in the debate. It is taken as read that both health and social care are of immense importance to both the Scottish Government and to the Scottish Parliament. And in their own ways, both do a vital service for the communities across the country. Although when it comes to the present operational delivery of services into the community, we could not say working quite separately from each other, and we couldn't say working completely together. I think we know that that would be wrong to say that. So the Government's attempts to bring together big organisations such as the health and social care to deliver even better outcomes for our people is to be welcomed. There is an added incentive with budgets under pressure to find ways to do a better job for more people, but with the same resources. It's a goal worth striving for. To achieve that goal, we need everyone pulling together, and in my view, the third sector involvement is key to bringing about success. There is a high level of experience within the third sector and the private sector when dealing with the health and social care, and must do everything we can to learn from that and put it to good use. As well as experience, the third sector bring a different perspective in health and social care. They are able to look at these services from a user's viewpoint, and that is of fundamental importance when mapping out how best to offer best practice for patients and families alike. Without the third sector participation, I personally don't think the integration will work to the highest level we are seeking, and I commend the Scottish Government on their continued dialogue with those organisations who are also at the coalface. The integration of the health and social care is of utmost importance, and I am pleased that the Scottish Government is showing the leadership required to achieve it. This leadership is shown when we look at the policy of single budgets. Just like any other organisation, private or otherwise, no matter the size, the norm is to be precious about your budget and only spend it in areas where you have a direct influence or a direct responsibility. The fact that the budget is a unified one means that there are no artificial barriers either in mind or in a practical sense. In my view, this is the single biggest initiative in the proposal that leads me to believe that this will be a success by giving responsibility equally across the sectors. As our people live longer, the services they require will become more complex, and to have two separate systems will not meet the expectations and service required for our people. A larger combined budget, in contrast to two smaller budgets, will allow clinicians, care professionals and health managers to rise to these challenges with the funding needed. This will also lead to achieving agreed health and social care outcomes, whilst putting an end to the practice of cost shunting between the NHS and local government. Away from the financial aspects of both sectors, when we look at both health and social care, it makes sense for them to be integrated in the first place. I am pleased that this is about integration of services, and that the Government are clear that it is not about structural changes, and staff in both sectors will be using their expertise as is at the present time. I am also pleased that a massive transfer of staff between employers is neither sought nor desired, which will be of great comfort to those involved and ensure a smooth transition. Where there is an overlapping between both services, integration will be the most practical way to deliver a service which has the people at its centre. Individuals, their carers, family members will benefit most from the integration of these services, which is the basis for this change. Ensuring a successful integration will be hugely challenging but greatly rewarding. I feel that we have the leadership and we will carry this out, and will be those who use these services that will benefit most. I am also sure there will be tough decisions to make in future, both for health and for social care. But I look forward to the Government bringing forward this bill for Parliament's consideration as a way to making the number of tough decisions just that bit less. And I commend the motion in the name of Alec Neil, MSP, to the Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Duncan McNeill to be followed by Bob Doris. I would just draw members' attention to the fact that there is adequate time for interventions today and even loquaciousness.
Deputy Presiding Officer, the good news is that we are living longer. The bad news is, of course, that old age does not come alone, and those extra years are not always healthy years. Indeed, men and women can commonly expect now to spend around 7 and 9 years, respectively, in poor health. Scotland's National Dementia Strategy tells us that there are approximately 71,000 people with dementia in Scotland, and that figure is likely to double over the next 25 years. On Tuesday of this week, the Finance Committee was just the latest of parliamentary committees to highlight this significant demographic change, which the Office of Budget Responsibility has identified as the key source of long-term pressure on public finances. Local governments, of course, who are contending with increased demands and less money, and health services that are having to deal and manage with unplanned admissions, clearly don't need any reminding of the task and the situation that we face. But despite the recognition of the challenge of how we deliver health and care services at a time of rising demand and reduced finances, despite the work of committees of this Parliament, I and others through my convenership of the Local Government and Communities Committee and indeed in the Health and Sport Committee, have been on this case for some considerable time, as well as the work of Beveridge and Christie and indeed the work of government and others in this area. Progress has been slow and it has been patchy, and it's good that we have arrived at this point, because we cannot continue on as we are. It is important that we move forward, instigate significant cultural change in how we deliver those services, and if we are to address those huge challenges to come, as the Minister recognises, the integration of health and social care is at the heart of that change. But as he knows and has referred to today, the barriers are significant. The reform of public services is indeed difficult. If it was easy, we'd have done it. But one of the things I think that we need to accept and accept those difficulties, I think it is worth recognising that sustained change and cultural change can be achieved best through working in cooperation, however difficult sometimes that can be. But change cannot only be seen, if we have to achieve this change, it cannot only be seen to be because of financial pressures. The truth is, we should have been doing this many years ago when there was more money as well, because the objective here is to improve services, and we've got to watch that we don't lose that focus. Change, as we have seen in self-directed support, cannot be perceived as a cheap option. And if the major budget holders, government, health service, local authorities, are still wrestling with one another, don't trust one another to share or shift budgets, is it any wonder that the minor parties in this process, the third and independent sectors, feel put upon, as referred to by my Health Committee colleague, Aileen MacLeod? this tension seeps into the workforce and indeed public perception, who can sometimes see change just as a fearful process that's going to lead to the decline in standards or indeed the quality of working conditions. And while clearly, as other colleagues have referred to, the Health and Sport Committee want to see this focus on the person first. We're all agreed on that. I think to address some of these fears and concerns, after 10 years of the current national care standards, we need to produce a new set of national care standards before this bill is published. National care standards with human rights at their heart, to reassure all of those who use and work in the health service that the main objective of this process and bill, the legislation, is maintaining and improving the services that we provide. We need clearly to ensure that we've got good regulation when those rights are established. That bringing together the Care Inspectorate and the Healthcare Improvement Scotland is absolutely essential to ensure that those rights and standards are maintained. Those agencies must be properly resourced and funded if we are to ensure the monitoring and the implementation of rights and standards. And we must honestly deal with a commissioning and procurement process that's predatory, that causes great mistrust and great pain to the third sector, where we see people shuffling along their problems. It's often seen, unfortunately, not as a process that simply improves the services or efficiency, but a crude attempt to drive down costs at the expense of quality. And we have dealt with some of those issues in this Parliament and indeed the committees. The worst of these excesses we have dealt with in this Parliament and the committees over the last few years. And finally, if we are going to say that this is the most important problem and this is the most important area, then the people who are going to work in that area, that workforce planning, cannot be ignored. They must and deserve our respect. The status of that newly emerging and existing workforce, which is essential in the delivery process, must be recognised through recognition, training and paying at least the living wage in this sector. Only if we address these issues do I believe that we can have a successful process to improve the efficiency and the quality of how we deliver public services to our most vulnerable. And I think if we address some of these issues alongside or before we bring forward the bill, I think that process will be made easier.
You could draw
and if the Cabinet Secretary is up for revolutionary change, if he wants to be radical, then he will have my support in that process. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on Bob Doris to be followed by Ian Gray. 6 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think I'd like to start by commending Duncan McNeill in his speech, which I thought was very thoughtful, and much in it not everything, but much in it I did absolutely agree with, and I think it's testament to the work that we did actually in the Local Government Committee in the previous session and currently in the Health and Sport Committee just now. Examples of, I think, the committee system in this Parliament serving the Parliament well and taking things forward in conjunction with the Government. I'm also delighted to speak in this debate because it ain't the debate we had yesterday, which I don't think we covered the Parliament in particular glory whatsoever, and many of us took part in that, and I see Jackie Bailey muttering perhaps both of us should reflect on the tone of that debate yesterday, but the tone of this debate is much better today, and the Parliament's well served for that. But there are strong links between today and yesterday's debate in terms of, for example, why are A&E units getting busier, and why are more people appearing needing a hospital procedure. And of course it's the demographic change, but it's also about getting things right in the community as well, and preventative spend, be it slips, trips and falls of our older people being reduced some things that can be done quite easily that aren't always being done effectively in our communities can drastically reduce those turning up at A&E and those needing stays in hospital. So integrating coordinated strategy for matters such as care at home, including prevention work, making sure we reduce presentations to hospital where people can be treated in the community, appropriate discharges from hospital. I don't like using delayed discharge or bed blocking, actually, because I don't want a quick or a slow delay of someone from hospital. I want someone discharged from hospital at a time that suits their care and medical needs, neither fast nor slow, but appropriate as far as I'm concerned. And I think that's something we all need to reflect on. I think that does need a single accountable officer, so that the buck cannot be passed in getting this strategy right. And there does have to be clear lines of accountability. I have to say there is a core role, of course there is, for local authorities in that, but some of the contributions from Ms Bailey perhaps made it sound as if it should be a dominant role, and I think that would be the wrong approach to take in relation to that. Perhaps we should look at what the Health and Sport, maybe to make this point first, Ms Bailey, and I will let you in, assuming that I get maybe a little bit of additional time, Presiding Officer, that would be welcome. The Health and Sport Committee did talk about, in a report on this, the committee acknowledges the findings of Audit Scotland that the governance and accountability arrangements for CHPs have been complex and not always clear. The committee therefore welcomes the Scottish Government's proposal for a clear line of accountability to the rest with a single individual for each health and social care partnership. It also said the committee also considers it essential that the governance arrangements for each local partnership should retain strong links with local government through representation of councillors on partnership boards. A clear and core role for local authorities, but not a dominant one. And of course, democratic elected bodies, as local authorities are, I would say also gently to some of my Labour colleagues, but saying just leave it to the Council, would have a shiver of fear running down Glaswegians right now, given what's happening in that city, and particularly in terms of protecting the most vulnerable, with 3 daycare centres just yesterday earmarked for closure without any proper consultation with the community. I also say to the Parliament, I felt the need to raise that point, because if I didn't raise that point, I think vulnerable people in Glasgow would think I'd be betraying them for not mentioning it at this stage. We've heard a lot about national standards and national care standards, and Duncan McNeill made some important points. I would ask maybe the Labour Party to reflect on the idea of using expressions such as postcode lottery. And what the committee had to say in relation to this in our report was the committee welcomes the intention of the Scottish Government to provide flexibility within a legislative framework which will prescribe minimum standards. So absolutely, we need those core minimum and enforceable standards, but we have to make sure minimum standards doesn't become the extent of our aspirations. We have to make sure local health boards and local authorities can, where they decide, invest more money and go beyond a basic minimum standard. And I think that's the issue I have in terms of where the Labour Party are, in terms of taking local democracy actually away from the system and leaving minimum standards as the only standard that people will receive. I think there's actually a threat to local democracy within that. I also think that in terms of how we take forward this agenda, there is a need for significant service redesign, and I agree with Duncan McNeill, we should be doing this irrespective of the demographic challenges and irrespective of the financial situation, because it's about improving the outcomes of all people in society, irrespective of those two things. But those two things are clear drivers for change, and I'm minded of that. And I think when we do that service redesign, the points we've made already, we have to make sure that the voluntary and the third sector are seen as equal partners. And I think there's a fear that if a local authority comes to the table with millions upon millions of pounds, as does health boards, that the third sector finds themselves squeezed out in terms of service design and redesign in the first place, and also in terms of a commissioning process which quite often looks at what you bring to the table rather than what you can actually do for the people who are most in need within our society. I would like to use some of the time that I have left to mention a couple of projects that I think are quite excellent in this context. The Good Morning project in North Glasgow, sorry, do you have time to let Miss Bailey in and get a little bit of... Miss Bailey, I apologise for not having time to let you in, but I think you'll find out it's far more important that we talk about the Good Morning project in North Glasgow, who, for hundreds of older people within the community, they get a friendly telephone call in the morning to provide them with the support and reassurance to sustain their tenancy and their place within society, to make sure they're not lonely, to make sure they're not isolated, and to make sure they can live happy, healthy and productive lives. An innovative way of keeping older people happy. And also the South Lanarkshire Hands-On project, which the Minister visited with myself in Cambuslang, about a handyman service and a befriender service, innovative ways of service redesign to support older people within the community. My final point, Presiding Officer, would say is that rather than the Good Morning project or the Hands-On project or the hundreds and hundreds of projects around the country looking for a fragmented funding system to keep their projects going from one year to the next, wouldn't it be good if with health and social care integration they had a seat at the table and they get some core secured funding with a core secured long-term strategy for health and social care provision? And it's a shame that we need this piece of legislation to deliver that, but we do need this piece of legislation and I thoroughly welcome it.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I will now call on Ian Gray to be followed by George Adam.
Deputy Presiding Officer, last year the outgoing Auditor General Bob Black audited the joint commissioning of social care by the NHS and local government. He called it one of the most significant performance audits he had ever prepared. Firstly, because of the demographic change which many speakers have referred to. Bob Black pointed to a projected 147% rise in people aged over 85 in the next 25 years. But secondly, because he said he had audited these services 6 times in 12 years and could find little evidence of any significant improvement. Only 32 councils, of 32 councils, only 11 had any strategy at all for joint commissioning of social care. Only 4 even considered demographic changes, and only 1 was more than short-term. Audit Scotland struggled to find any good joint planning underpinned by an understanding of the shared resources available. That report also showed that for the very first time, the majority of actual care, both at home and in a residential setting, is now delivered by neither the NHS or councils, but by myriad private, independent or third sector providers. So what? So, an elderly lady struggling to stay at home has daily care assessed by the council but delivered by an agency that sends different carers every week. Her bath is provided by an NHS service but not the GP surgery she knows well. Meanwhile, her shopping service comes from a completely different department of the council, and the highlight of her week, someone who visits to take her out for a short walk, is the responsibility of a local voluntary organisation. When one of them fails to turn up, she doesn't know who to call, and whoever she does call knows nothing. When she goes into hospital, as happens every so often, all these services are removed and every one of them has to be reinstated. Sometimes that takes weeks or months, dozens of phone calls and a bewildering array of highly paid professionals. And there are some basic needs like nail cutting which turn out to be no one's responsibility at all. This is my family's lived experience of the care system for an elderly aunt. But it is not unique, and it is why we need integration. But I have seen the capacity of the NHS and local councils to agree the need, but resist the change. It is 13 years since, as a health minister, I got them to promise they would pool budgets through joint futures committees, and 13 years on, the joint futures committees are still there, and so are the separate budgets. And so I hope I can be forgiven if I'm a little more sceptical than some colleagues about the willingness to change. It is informed by experience. And I think the government's proposals are themselves in danger of becoming as complex and convoluted as the care system they seek to reform. We are to have body corporate models of financial integration unless there is an agreed delegation between partners arrangement. There will be integrated resource frameworks and a non-hierarchical relationship between CPPs and HSCPs. I don't know what all that means. Accountability will be to both NHS boards and local authorities, because that's working really well. And we can have confidence in all of this through single outcome agreements, which is nice, because most of us assumed they had died a death a long, long time ago. This adds up to a committee where NHS and councils will argue forever over how much of their budget they're willing to share. The consultation shows they're already arguing about their voting rights and dispute resolution procedures. For all I know, they're arguing over where they'll sit and whose turn it is to bring the biscuits. They are not arguing about the care standards we need. We are in danger of paying senior professionals serious salaries to sit in endless meetings looking after their own budgets, while actually looking after people is being done by a minimum wage workforce in 10-minute care visits with no time allowed between clients and orders not to waste time speaking to them. And even that parody of care will only be available to those who are assessed as in critical need. Now, I believe that the Cabinet Secretary is absolutely sincere in his desire for the integration revolution that he described. And like him, I think it is a revolution we need. And it is not too late to use this opportunity to deliver it. He can create a proper, formula-based, local integrated budget so that the local negotiation is about delivery and not about the share of budgets. He can legislate for a clear single line of accountability through democratically elected councillors answerable to their local communities. He can insist on clear basic standards like giving users and carers a single point of contact to manage all their care. What could be simpler? Yes, the Cabinet Secretary can do these things if he is willing to show the leadership he himself talked about, to call time on the vested interests in both sides of this debate, indeed all sides of this debate. And he can then create a care service our elderly and disabled citizens can depend on and we can all be proud of. If we don't do that, our successors will be back here 13 years later again, doing this all over again.
Many thanks. I now call on George Adam to be followed by Jim Hume. Up to 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I welcome this debate and in particular the serious tone and constructive tone of the debate, because this is too important a subject for us not to treat it with this type of respect. I welcome the bill and the need for integration of health and social care. And, Presiding Officer, I believe that our society is judged on how we care, help and support our older people, our vulnerable and those with long-term conditions. And I believe that this bill does focus on these issues. I appreciate that the Cabinet Secretary has explained the length the Scottish Government have gone to regarding integration and engagement with health and social care professionals and users, as this is too important an issue, as I've said, and one we must get correct first time. The changing shape of Scotland's society and more older people and an ageing population is something of a challenge that we've all had to face for a number of years now. I remember my time in Renfrewshire Council, where one of the first things as a member of the Scrutiny Board, we discussed demographic change and the challenge of this and how we could deliver services as a local authority. And I know other authorities have looked at that as well. And as the Cabinet Secretary quite rightly says, Presiding Officer, there are many councils and many organisations working together towards these joint goals to ensure that they can deliver for our people in our communities. But improving the outcomes for the families and the carers in our community, and the focus on this part of the bill is the most important part for me, because at the end of the day it's people's lives that we're dealing with, and we've all had various stories as elected members of situations where the system hasn't worked. And we have to make sure, as elected members, that we can make a system where it can be seamless for people to go through the system as well. The Cabinet Secretary is correct that public agencies and organisations must share the challenge and work together, and moving away from silos and silo management ideas, because this is something that I've experienced, whether it be with my wife with her long-term conditions, or with constituents who have difficulties trying to access the services that they need to access. But I would like to go on from my local government and local council background. During that time, I got a great belief in the work that social work did within our communities. And I saw it as a councillor, what they did, particularly with older people and some of the groups that they deal with. And one of the stories I had was one that was as simple as an older man who was effectively coming home to die, and his wife, they're both in their 80s, and we couldn't get the care package in place to get the elderly gentleman home. And the wife was extremely worried by this. Now, it took a phone call to me to social work to actually be able to get that done. And for me, that's the difference with social work at a local level, is the fact that I, as an elected member, can contact the social work department in the council and get something done where it can be rather difficult with the health boards to do something likewise. It's my belief that I was actually, if I asked the local health board, it would be even more difficult. But 1 in 12 people use social work services at one point in their life. The social work departments in our council are protecting children, supporting people with mental health issues, people with addictions and people with learning disabilities. So let's not forget the role that social work has and the accountability that it has to local communities. The success of the services offered by social care staff and their commitment working in very challenging situations must be recognised, as many are driven to help and work beyond the call of duty to protect and care for our vulnerable people within our communities. Integration must take all of this into account. As I said, frontline staff will be the key to making integrated service a practical reality, and it is the skills and staff within health and social care that will deliver and the results that we all want. If I can mention that it will take leadership and management, we need effective, robust and innovative leadership at all levels that will be central to the success and transformation programme. In particular, it will be crucial to have a clear focus on putting leadership by social workers, care professionals and clinicians at the heart of all integrated health service delivery. As Cabinet Secretary said, we must move away from organisational silos, but we must retain the services that do actually work. I welcome the bill that delivers the outcomes of the individual, the family or the client. Integration being delivered locally is extremely important, and ensuring that it is accountable is equally as important. I think the idea of the Chief Accountable Officer will help in that accountability, obviously working with the Health Board and with social work at local council, bridging the gap between the Health Board and the local authority. The NHS and social care staff are the ones that really have to deliver this, and we have to ensure that they buy in and work with us on this as well. And we have to make sure we use all their talents. But, this change isn't new to people in local government and social work. Social work services have operated in an integrated manner across the range of needs in their communities and have been particularly strength for Scottish social services over the last 40 years. So we need to tap into that practical professionalism and expertise. And the integration of health and social care is indeed a radical new way of working for our health and social care professionals. But we need to ensure that that expertise of the local social work departments, of the health experts, across Scotland are not forgotten. As the Cabinet Secretary says, many of the partner organisations are working this way already. We have to ensure that they continue to work that way. And let's hope, like Ian Gray already said, we aren't coming back here in 20 years' time and having the same conversation. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Now call on Jim Hume to be followed by James Dornan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think the need to integrate health and social care in Scotland has been on the agenda for some time, and I do welcome the consultation results, noting that this Government intends to introduce this bill this year. And I take this chance to, of course, remind everyone that this is also part of the Liberal Democrat manifesto. In fact, we could argue that the bill should have been introduced long ago when beds were reduced for more care at home, as it could be argued that systems for caring at home were not fully in place for that step change. The existing system, without doubt, has overlaps of responsibility between health boards, local authorities and, of course, care services. It's also worth noting that organisations like these do have different ways of working. They have different cultures and different language almost. Therefore, there may be barriers to integrating. But outcomes are what we want, and I'm sure that this bill will have that potential to iron out any differences in differing methods from different organisations. I also hope that this bill addresses these and bridges the gap, and leading to an even better provision for patients and users who require these services, hopefully leading to more individuals to stay in their homes for treatment, where of course it's appropriate. If this bill, once introduced, does what it says in the tin, then it shall get our support. That support shall be conditional, of course, and what I shall be keeping a close eye on is that local decision-making is protected, and would oppose any centralisation in the form of a national care service. To make this integration work, I think we do need local accountability. And in fact, I'd go further at this point and state that it's essential that in the progress of this bill and the changes it will make for our constituents, that patients also be treated as an equal and active partner in decision-making and planning. Presiding Officer, integrating health and social care will not be an easy matter, and the number of representations we have received already echo this. It's important to note that housing associations have an important role to play also. 85% of very sheltered and extra care homes are run by housing associations, and it's also estimated that the demand for that service shall increase. I've already mentioned that keeping people in their homes where appropriate has great benefits, and note that essential for that to happen is the use of adaptations. Research also shows that adaptations is good value for public money, with an estimated £4 saved for every £1 spent. An excellent example of preventative spend, which of course we all need to focus more on. The consultation reports on a jointly accountable officer, and some believing that the responsibility should lie jointly between local authority, chief executives, health boards and health partnership. And the Cabinet Secretary has already mentioned this in some way, but it's worth noting that often the health board has several local authorities within it. So I'm glad that the Cabinet Secretary recognises that, and of course it would be interesting to see how we could address this in the future. That could be cumbersome, of course, and we shall keep an eye on that governance. The consultation did highlight that there was general agreement that whoever may be the jointly accountable officer, they must of course have gravitas and a wide skill base. Presiding Officer, I mentioned that the overall responsible person for delivery of integrating health and social care must have a good skill base, but I therefore think it's worth noting that we should look to deliver these changes with the help of those who have experience of joint working. I think particularly of the allied health professions. They have a track record on medical versus social views of different ways to deliver services, but they're experts in rehabilitation and reablement, a knowledge of around 12 professions, and are already in post, of course. Therefore, in the deliberations of the Minister, Cabinet Secretary, I should say, I would like his view on representation for allied health professions being part of the development of national policy and regulation in the integration of health and social services. Presiding Officer, there is no doubt that there shall be an increased demand on our health and social services. We have an ageing population and limited public resources. We shall all call on their services in the not-so-distant future, unfortunately, and we of course all know of family and friends that have already done so, and we must ensure that we are able to meet the needs for the 21st century. There are good examples of partnership working across Scotland, mainly at an organisational level. We need to now concentrate more on delivery of first-class services for our patients and users. We need a system where people don't fall between organisations' responsibility. For example, clearing a bed in a hospital only to put a burden on a local authority extra care home bed must be part of that joint-up thinking of the future. Presiding Officer, I welcome the results of the consultation. Myself and the Liberal Democrats shall follow this bill in its progress and hope to see a better integration of services in the future with local accountability protected.
Thank you very much. I now call on James Dornan to be followed by John Pentland, and before I do, I again point out to the Chamber that there is still time for extensive debate and interventions, should anyone wish.
Thanks for that reminder, Presiding Officer, before I go up to speak. Like most others, I welcome the Government's plans to introduce the integration of health and social care. I am confident that this bill will help bring together the best of what both the NHS and local authorities, along with the third and independent bodies, have to offer to make life that bit better and treatment much more streamlined for those of us who will invariably need it at some time in our lives. As Jim Hume just said, for some of us it's nearer than others, I suspect. It's great to see the support from organisations such as the Independent Living Movement, who speak on behalf of the Independent Living in Scotland, SDSS and Inclusion Scotland, and agree that disabled people must be at the heart of the decision-making process. And I'm delighted there will be a strengthened role for the third and independent sectors in the planning and delivery of services. The 5 asks of the bill: support independent living, citizenship and human rights. Disabled people must be considered and supported as key stakeholders and co-producers in the delivery and development of the bill. Involved in leading on principles and how money is spent, should support and promote SDS in the community on leaving hospital, and should not entrench existing inequalities, are all reasonable asks. And it's clear from the Cabinet Secretary's opening remarks that these are already being given careful consideration. I also agree with the BMA when it says that effective health and social care partnerships do have the potential to reduce duplication, ensure appropriate care is delivered at the right time to the right people in the right place, and genuinely break down some of the unhelpful barriers that exist between health and social care. And I can't see how we do that without the integration envisaged in the bill. I have some experience of working in an environment similar to what is envisaged with the bill, and saw the benefits of such a structure. In my time as a councillor, one of my most fulfilling roles was as a member of Glasgow South East CHCP, Community Health and Care Partnership, which covered both Glasgow, Cathcart and Govan constituencies with areas of huge problems and challenges within them. I won't deny that when I joined, there were tensions between those from the Health Board and those from the local authority, both at committee level and, as we heard from practitioners and other frontline staff, in offices across the city. This was understandable. After all, we were asking people to rethink the way they worked, take into consideration people from another service with different work practices and, to some extent, different priorities. But it was a commitment between most of the members of the CHCP to make this a success, and through hard work and commitment, driven by the human dynamo that is Cathy Cowan, who many of you will know, things started to turn around. There were a number of staff away days, or greeting sessions as they were called, where people got to quiz the directors about the reasoning and direction of the CHCP and voice general concerns and complaints, and they would get straight answers from the directors present. There was a great interaction with representatives of the users of the service, and meetings were held in public. Things were definitely turning around, and you began to see a real change in attitude, not so much from the board, that was already there for the main part, but from the workforce and users. Staff began to see the benefit of having someone from a related service across the room from you or just down the hall, and users could see it was working. You could see the results in terms of home care for the elderly, and some of the other work helping alleviate bed blocking was really encouraging. The work being done in addictions was showing particularly good outcomes. And yet, as soon as any substantial moves to devolving further powers, and particularly funds, to CHCP raised its ugly head, the shutters came up and all the head honchos moved into their silos. This is why I am so supportive of this bill, and why, unfortunately, as Bob Doris says, I think it's necessary. Intentions may be good, results on the ground may be great, but when it comes to sharing some of that power, institutions have then seen none of what that has been happening before seems to account for anything, so legislation is undoubtedly required. And it's also why I'm so disappointed with Labour's amendment. I had to go and rewrite my speech today because my speech was all going to be about the positive outcomes of this bill and my experiences as a CHCP, but I don't think we can let the amendment go unnoticed. I mean, we expect an attack on the Scottish Government and an amendment, no matter what the subject being debated. That's fine, that's politics. But this is more than that. It appears clear to me that, again, instead of looking for what is best for the people of Scotland, Labour are doing the work of what they consider to be their last bulwark of support, Labour-run local authorities. In this case, as so often, it's Glasgow. I was there when Labour-run Glasgow City Council reneged on commitments to devolve funds to the CHCP, and it was this intransigence that eventually brought about the demise of the regional model in favour of a Glasgow-wide Labour-controlled version, which was eventually disbanded before it even got started. That was my shortest membership of any committee. I eventually got on it, and before it met, they had disbanded it, which was quite an achievement, I've got to say. I certainly will.
Becky Bailey.
Can I thank the member very much for the intervention? I'm clearly missing something with his interpretation of our amendment. And, can I suggest to him that this isn't just for Labour councils, this is for SNP councils. Indeed, it's for every council across Scotland. I wonder whether I could invite him to comment on the suggestion, perhaps, that executive directors of health boards should somehow be on these new integrated partnerships. Does he support a payroll vote?
Having been a councillor in Glasgow City Council, I have seen a payroll vote at work, and what I would suggest is that we have a joint accounting officer, as suggested in the bill. In your amendment, what you say is, with a strong role for local authorities. In your opening comments, your main thrust was it was important that local authorities had control of this. I have seen what happens in the biggest city in Scotland when local authorities are in control of something which should have joint control, and the people of Glasgow suffered from it. The CHCP that I was a part of was a huge success and would have went on to much greater things, and it was supported by everybody except for Labour Glasgow city councillors and executive directors. It was them that brought it to an end, and that's the facts. It's very unfortunate, and it's a shame that we're having to have this debate on this debate, because I do think that what we should have had here is a debate about the merits of CHCP and not about making sure that power stays within local authorities. And if you think I'm exaggerating about the Labour's unwillingness to part with control for the sake of the success of the CHCP, then let me read you some of GHA's response to the consultation. Palliamble Glasgow Council, I'm afraid. The proposals are overly prescriptive on organisational arrangements. We want to stay in control. We consider the proposals are going too far in prescribing arrangements for partnerships. We want to stay in control. But we would assert that the mechanisms for how these outcomes are met should be agreed locally. This is what happened in Glasgow the last time. Nothing got done as soon as we hit the slightest bump. The Labour went into their silo and the whole thing fell about. When asked, will joint accountability to ministers and local authority leaders provide the right balance of local democratic accountability and accountability to central government for health and social care services? No, councils are accountable to the electorate. So within that 5-year period, as it is just now, we can let the CHCP go, we can close down daycare centres, we can do whatever we want and hope that by the time the election comes round that people have forgotten about it. That is not the best interests of the most vulnerable in our society. There are lots of things at stake here. There was some really good work going on. Somebody, I think it was Jim Hume, it was George Adam, talked about the work that the social workers are doing. The amount of great close work between the social workers and the health board workers was fantastic. The problem does not lie in the ground. The problem lay up there. I think it's vital that we make sure that this bill passes. And just as an aside, I know of a doctor who works in Glasgow who says that she's terrified if the local authority get control of this, because she remembers the last time and the money will end up going to pay for something else. It's a favourite of the Glasgow City Council. It's vital that this is taken out of the control of local authorities. It's vital that we have that joint accounting officer, and I look forward to the bill being passed in the future.
Many thanks. Now call on John Pentland to be followed by Mark McDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The arguments for better integration of health and social care have always been strong. Over the last 20-odd years, there have been successive, but not uniformly successful attempts to move services in this direction, with each fresh attempt encountering fresh obstacles. Too often reforms are seen as an opportunity to pass on responsibility while retaining funding, and this is always more tempting in an era of shrinking budgets. Partners have signed up to integration, but it's too easy for initiatives to be seen as solutions for one partner's immediate problems, such as bed blocking, without them being too concerned about how the solution works in practice. Of course, it makes good financial sense to support someone in the community. I was told it costs 4 times as much to support an inpatient, but financial gains should not come at the expense of the overall quality of service and support, which is difficult to avoid in severely cash-constrained local government. With real-term cuts in central government funding and underfunded council tax fees and few other sources of income, something has got to give. And it appears to me that the most vulnerable are among the biggest givers. they are faced with either losing services or paying for them. As an FOI evidence shows, income generation does not just come from car parking and leisure charges, and it is clear that social care charges have increased, and the pattern of cuts in charges is very uneven. You could even call it a postcode lottery. So I congratulate those councillors who have done their best to protect services while keeping charges down, and lay responsibility for their dilemma firmly and squarely with the Scottish Government. Now, that said, this is not just about budgets. The postcode lottery faced by Scotland's elderly and disabled is further exacerbated by the lack of a coherent and consistent strategy for care. We need clearer plans from the Scottish Government to address the demographic challenge that we face. We need better funding for health and social care to meet the needs of increasing numbers of service users. We need to build consensus, which is difficult when the current situation pits partners against each other. And we also need to avoid service developments being held back by those in power, taking a narrow view of a service in a particular location, rather than recognising the best interests of the service users across an area. Cross-party support for better joined-up health and social care services is undermined by the current set-up, which fosters annual conflict. But by concentrating on structural reform at senior level in the organisations and focusing on who controls budgets, the Scottish Government is neglecting issues about how to improve services on the ground. And that is what I am told by the people on the ground. Change should happen, but it needs to be driven by reviewing at a local level that works well and what could be improved by integrating health and social care services. Local delivery needs a strengthened role for local authorities, not a diluted one. A fully integrated delivery structure should be led by local authorities and underpinned by legislation. There should be straightforward and direct Scottish Government funding to health and social care partnership using an allocation system which is sensitive to local needs. And it is significant that much of the current agenda is being driven by an attempt to prevent bed blocking. However, bed blocking was not an issue in all the areas, and therefore not all councils or health boards are starting from the same base. The proposals as they stand at present are focused on structure, which budgets are to be included and who controls them. They say little about the outcomes that have to be delivered. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary has said that this is a revolution. Ian Gray has said, don't let us wait for another 20 years. So let's give the care that people expect to receive in an open and transparent system to support their delivery, with local health and social work organisations that are to be locally determine the best way to deliver outcomes. So let's get away from the current divide and rule tactics, which I don't think the Cabinet Secretary is trying to create, and let's concentrate instead on creating a national care service that truly integrates health and social care services.
Thank you very much. I now call on Mark McDonald, a generous 7 minutes, the time for verbal virtuosity.
Well, gosh, Presiding Officer, the number of times at the end of a debate that I find myself being told the member has 3.5 minutes or 2 minutes or 4 minutes. Finally, the reward for patience. But I was interested, Presiding Officer, by the... Don't worry, this will be worth it. But I was interested by the Labour amendment today, Presiding Officer. Particularly the phrase which stuck out to me was avoid conflict between local authorities and NHS boards. And the reason that interested me is I wanted to explore in my speech today an example of what is happening in practice in terms of where the Labour Party has some control, and that is in the city of Aberdeen. Because Aberdeen City Council yesterday voted to establish a local authority trading company for social care. There had been previous votes at the full council around the business case, but yesterday it voted to take that one step further. It will involve the transfer of 750 staff, 3 care homes, occupational therapy and rehabilitation services to a new arm's-length company, Bonaccord Care. Indeed, the Council has also found within itself, and it was interesting to hear Jackie Baillie talking about the issue of tough choices and how this was driven by budgetary pressure. Well, of course, at the budget-setting meeting in February, the leader of Aberdeen City Council announced that there would be no cuts in the Aberdeen City Council budget, a clear example of strong funding settlement from the Scottish Government and good stewardship of the council finances by the previous administration. But one of the interesting things is that as part of the establishment of the local authority trading company, a consultant has been hired. A consultant who will form the part of the management team, indeed is named as a director and sole shareholder in Bonaccord Care Limited. And the council for this consultant are going to pay £42,800 for 12 weeks' work. That's a pro rata salary equal to £170,000 a year, more than the chief executive of Aberdeen City Council is being paid. And when challenged about this expenditure, the social care convener, Len Ironside, said, "These are the experts, they have set up these types of companies before." Effectively, it's because they're worth it, Presiding Officer. While I think that many in Aberdeen would question whether spending that kind of money on a consultant is really what they should be looking for in the delivery of social care services in the city of Aberdeen. But it's not just there that there are concerns. Indeed, the Chief Executive of NHS Grampian, Richard Carey, has stated his concerns. He says the creation of the LATC does not prevent integration. It does, however, restrict the range and nature of the partnership. We have expressed concern to the Council that the opportunities for integration to deliver best value through changing service delivery may be restricted. It is therefore not integration that is potentially at risk, but the ability of the eventual partnership to deliver the changes as required in reshaping care for older people. And among those areas which are of concern, the opportunity to look at innovative staffing models on a joint basis is severely restricted. The LATC was described by the Council as remaining 100% under Council control, but would compete in the marketplace, effectively selling services to people who can afford it and are willing to pay. If there is an inability to recruit home care staff, Mr Carey says, the available hours of care should be directed towards those in most need, not those who can pay. Mr Carey goes on to say the ability to pool the budget and use resource flexibly across health and social care is impacted upon, as the LATC plan involves issuing a 5-year contract for £26 million. This will restrict the ability and flexibility of the partnership to reallocate resource to match the assessed needs of the population as described in the Joint Strategic Commissioning Plan. The flexibility normally associated with a contracting model of procurement is restricted. One second. Savings made or profits generated by the LATC shall either be redirected by the LATC to create other services or result in profits to the Council. Mr Carey says it is difficult to visualise how this will enable the integrated partnership to make the savings necessary to generate additional capacity to support the increasing number of older people in the local population. And his final point, integrated partnership will be required to create a strong ethos of partnership working not only between the NHS and social work service but also with the third and independent care sectors, and states the NHS are aware of the concerns being expressed by both the third and independent care sectors of the competitive nature of the LATC, and this may have implications for the partnership. Mr McNeill.
Duncan McNeill.
Yes, I thank the member. You promised that the extra time you had was going to be worth it. So when you stop reading out the minutes of Aberdeen Council, when are we getting to the good part of this speech?
Mark McDonald.
Well, that wasn't worth it. But what I would say to Mr McNeill is, I'm not reading out the minutes of Aberdeen City Council, Mr McNeill. I am reading out the very deep concerns that the Chief Executive of NHS Grampian has about the behaviour of Mr McNeill's colleagues in administration in Aberdeen and the policies they are pursuing. So Mr McNeill would perhaps do well to pay attention to what Mr Carey has to say. In particular, let's listen to the response that was given by the finance convener of Aberdeen City Council, one councillor, Willie Young. His response to Mr Carey's concerns was, I would say, get off our lawn. I promise not to interfere in his business if he won't interfere in ours. They are actively undermining us at each and every opportunity. The only thing that is being undermined here is the ability of the health and social care integration in Aberdeen to deliver the best results for the people of Aberdeen. But it's not just NHS Grampian that have concerns. No. It's not just NHS Grampian who have concerns. Also, Unison have said that they have grave concerns that this will result in an erosion in the terms, conditions and pension entitlement of our members and a two-tier workforce. And we can look at examples elsewhere where local authority trading companies have been set up. Unfortunately, we have to look out with Scotland because this is the only example that currently exists within Scotland. Perhaps that ought to be instructive. But if we look to the situation in Barnet and a release from Unison in Barnet on the 1st of March, which said that despite the fact that staff were transferred under TUPE, just over 1 year on, 170 staff will be presented with a redundancy consultation document outlining what Unison in Aberdeen were saying, that this leads to significant challenges and potential risks for staff in the future. But it's not just in this area that there are issues in Aberdeen, because my colleague Kevin Stewart wrote to the Cabinet Secretary in February about the emerging care crisis in Aberdeen. 66 elderly and disabled in the city who were assessed as requiring essential care but were still on the waiting list for care from the Council, and the Chief Executive herself having to intervene in some cases. And despite attempts by SNP group councillors, including my colleague Councillor Jim Kiddie, to get the Council to convene a care summit, the Labour Council would not even consider the motion from Councillor Kiddie for a care summit. And these developments are not a result, as Jackie Baillie claims, of budgetary pressures. It is all about political dogma from the Labour-led Council. Labour in Aberdeen are using social care users as guinea pigs in a bizarre political experiment. They ought to think again.
Thank you very much. We now move to closing speeches, and I call on Jackson Carlaw, a very generous 7 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Well, what an exhilarating, zip-zinging, thrilling extravaganza of an afternoon it's proved to be. Season ticket holders to this sort of consensual event will know that my appreciation of the spectacle knows no bounds. On Tuesday, we had a 3-hour debate on the ageing demographic. This afternoon, we had a 2.25-hour debate on the consequences of it, 5.25 hours about an ageing Scotland, and I have to say, for most of us in that 5.5 hours, did we age just ever so slightly in consequence. I wondered when Jackie Baillie opened by saying that she was bringing the parliamentary week to a close with her speech, if she knew something about proceedings this afternoon the rest of us did not, and that we were all going to be released immediately after that, but in fact, no, the debate continued. And that's not to take away from the importance of it and the very many contributions of note that were made to it, because we start from a policy around which all 4 major parties' manifestos were committed at the last Scottish election. And so it is genuinely a path forward to which we are all committed and all wish to see success. I wondered how Alec Neil would fill in his 13 minutes. And I don't know if even he was aware, but I thought I would just, while he was speaking, glance over the consultation Scottish Government response, only to find I was following his speech verbatim during the process, because large parts of his speech were actually printed out in this document, which, I mean, I would look to his civil servants to inject him with more flair and originality in his performances when he comes to the chamber than reading out documents which are in the public domain, but not to take away from the importance and sense of all that was said. He made reference to the 315 written responses, the public meetings, the participation in all of that. He talked about a revolution. I looked around at the revolutionaries. Hardly Les Miserables, I thought, but, nonetheless, there is a commitment, I think, around the Chamber and beyond, that this will require a huge effort of will. And I will come to Ian Gray shortly, because I thought his was, for me, the key contribution of the afternoon. But I was struck in the early contributions. Radical, inclusive delivery, service users, carers, governance, culture, vision, ambition, the sort of corporate language which I think sometimes drowns out the intention, well-meant intention of all we are trying to achieve. And I thought Jackie Baillie did. She, I think, talked about ageing Scotland. I did mention on Tuesday in that debate, and some of you weren't here, so it's worth saying, because I think this Parliament is a reflection of it, that when it first met in 1999, there were only 8 members here who were 60 or over. By the end of this Parliament, there will be 46. A very considerable change in the demographic of this Parliament. 8 in the first Parliament, 15 in the second, 22 in the third, 46 in this, and many of you were keen to contribute this afternoon. So it is an ageing Scotland that we are dealing with, and as I think, was it Bob Doris, somebody said within the next 20 years most of us were going to be part of that. Not just in the next 20 years, today, here and now, the issue is pertinent. But Jackie Baillie, I think, made a very important point, and this is a theme throughout all of this, is that there are competing practices which have to be merged, and there will be a battle for somebody's current practice and culture to prevail, and in fact nobody's culture and practice can actually be allowed to prevail if this is going to be a successful process going forward. And I thought Nanette Milne was correct when she said that, local priorities, and Jim Hume touched on this. Now, I'll have to read Jim Hume's speech again carefully because I lost the plot at one point during it, but I promised so to do. But I think he was also saying that Scotland could sleep easy, actually, because he would be keeping an eye on the assurance that these local priorities were being respected. But it will be fundamental to the importance of what happens. Now, there were 2 contributions that I thought that struck me. The first was Duncan McNeill's. And I thought that there were 2 points in there. The first was a very impassioned plea from him that we all remember that an improvement of services is actually at the heart of what we are trying to achieve, and that objective should not be lost. He, I think, was advocating a charter of sorts to try and underpin that, but the emphasis on the fact that an improvement of services is necessary was key. And secondly, his point about workforce planning, and I think this leaked slightly into what Ian Gray talked about as well subsequently, because it's terribly important that the people who are actually part of the workforce that deliver this are the right people in the right jobs, doing the right functions at the right time, and are suitably motivated to do that. In between that and Ian Gray, we had a contribution from Bob Doris. To borrow an old phrase, he did the crime but didn't do the time, in the sense that he took the extra minutes that were offered to him but then didn't give way as he'd promised to do in return for those extra minutes having been awarded. And poor Jackie Baillie was left floundering. But maybe not the right. But the key contribution for me, however, this afternoon was that of Ian Gray, and I think he illuminated the actual experience that we are all trying to legislate to change. I like the phrase, agree the need but resist the change. In the age debate on Tuesday, when I noted in the report of the committee the phrase depends on cultural change, I said I wasn't optimistic without being pessimistic, because, as I said then, the exigencies of today so very often get in the way and stand against the change that is needed in a much more comprehensive and radical way to prepare for the future. And I am concerned, and I thought that essentially in the language that the powerful contribution he made when he talked about the language becoming corporate and complicated, we could get to a point where this is all-inclusive in the sense that we are all-inclusive in not understanding what it's actually trying to say to us as it seeks to deliver the change. So those pitfalls have to be avoided. And I think it is a powerful point that he made, that the discussions should actually be about delivery and not about the share of the budget. And that did register with me in the course of the afternoon. Thereafter, there was a bit of the usual kind of, did we have to have a sort of a bit of a bash at one another's perspective and all of this? I don't think it was necessary. The quote of the afternoon, I have to say, notwithstanding that, did come from James Dorman. I've taken that down. I have served in Glasgow and seen a payroll vote at work. I enjoyed that. Having lived in Glasgow, never served in it, I am a Conservative after all, I have seen the payroll vote at work as well. But let's get back to the point of this. This was an afternoon's debate around the response of the government to the consultation. I hope that they are still open and listening, even having given the response that they have. I was grateful to the Cabinet Secretary's response to Nanette Milne in terms of councils potentially coming together to work within a single partnership. I think there are other areas yet where, if we are going to make this a success and avoid the kind of problem that Ian Gray identified of another generation of politicians, since with 46 members here who are 60 or over, it probably won't be the same generation of politicians in 30 years identifying all of this, then the consensual approach has to continue through the partnership of all of the political parties here and all of those organisations we've been talking about beyond.
Many thanks. Excellent. I now call on Dr. Richard Simpson. Up to 9 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As Jackson Carlaw has indicated, this discussion goes back a long way. It goes back even before devolution. In fact, in 1979, the Mitchell report talked about the liaison, as they said at that point, between social work and healthcare. So we've been debating this for a long, long time. And as many speakers have said, the challenge of the demographic changes upon us, and the debate on Tuesday indicated that. And as Duncan McNeill said, it isn't just going to intensify, it's also associated with longer periods of not such good health, chronic disability or long-term conditions. So the challenge is intensifying year by year. And yet, the previous attempts, which this Parliament has supported, with almost exactly the same sorts of speeches we've had, except for the 3 or 4 from the SNP benches simply attacking Labour councils, I have to say, the speeches on the whole have been exactly the same. So the desire, the ambition, the aspiration is there. And in 2000-2001, we established the Joint Futures Programme, as Ian has referred to. And we started with an ambitious pilot in Perth and Kinross. We were going to amalgamate social care and health care. They spent 2 years wrangling about terms and conditions of staff, but they then finally get going. 2.5 years later, it collapsed. And the reason it collapsed on this occasion was the leadership withdrew their support. So the lesson I take from that, and we should take lessons from our previous failures, is that without strong commitment and strong leadership from both the government and from the local authority and from the health board, we are doomed to another 13 years of talking about this, but seeing only a small number of reasonably good practice actually occurring. Now, how did Labour respond to this? Well, we legislated for the CHPs in 2004. But at that time, it was to build upon 85 local healthcare cooperatives, which were the groupings of primary care practices, and try and link social work teams to them. Actually, they were destroyed by the CHPs. There are very few local healthcare cooperatives left now, and the GPs and primary care staff disengaged from the process. So far from integrating, what we actually achieved was disintegration. And we need to learn from that lesson as well, because if we disengage primary care staff from this, then we will be in trouble. And a number of speakers have said today something else, I think, which is of fundamental importance, that the world is changing out there, and the third sector are now providing an increasing volume of the services that are vital to an integrated health and social care. So they must have a strong place at the table. Now, since that time, we've had Creera, we've had Christie, and we've had Beveridge. And I thought, in a very thoughtful contribution Duncan McNeill showed us, that reform is now going to be more difficult in a period of austerity than it would have been at a time of considerable additional funding. And it is going to be very difficult for us not to portray this as cost-cutting. Labour, in foreseeing the problem, foreseeing the need for change, established the Commission under Sir John Arbuthnot. And far from what it was portrayed by the SNP, with the usual knockabout party politics, which we all love on both sides, we were not seeking the establishment of a new national quango. What we were seeking was national standards, underpinning locally democratic revisions of the CHPs. And those national standards were referred to again by Duncan McNeill today. We need them now, Minister, before the bill. They will underpin where we're going forward. Because as a number of speakers have said, it is outcomes that are going to matter. That will be the thing that's important. I thought the eloquent speech by Ian Gray, actually saying what the reality of an individual out there is. All these services being provided, but if something goes wrong, you've no idea who to turn to. And that really is not satisfactory. Now, the ASDW has tended to welcome the integration, but doesn't want structural change. I think they're not right in that. I think we do need to revise the structures. But I think they are right in saying that we need to do two things. One is we need to make sure that this time we don't do what happened the previous time, and that is we must not destroy the good practice that already exists. And some of the flexibility in the bill in that respect is welcome, but I think other aspects are not. So we need a mapping exercise to see if there are more than the 11 councils engaged in this process that Audit Scotland found, and we need then to build on those and make sure they're not destroyed. Now, resources are clearly going to be important. We believe that actually this will have to be centrally determined. We've tried aligning budgets, and John Duncan, in a speech which I otherwise actually thought was pretty awful, was right about one thing, that there was a disintegration in Glasgow. But the disintegration was caused by two partners, not by one. The two partners could not agree, and that was really important. And, you know, Mark McDonald, in his speech, which was entirely about Aberdeen, referred to the Aberdeen City Council's project. I have to say to him that this project was actually started under the SNP, not under Labour. Labour may have carried it through, but it was your party that started it. And both parties are simply trying to solve the difficult problem of meeting a huge resource, which you said, 65 people waiting. How do you deal with that within your funding envelope? That is one possible solution. And in Sandwell, where they did this 16 years ago, and I would commend this to the Cabinet Secretary, they did this 16 years ago. They outsourced their care, and they have had a phenomenal success and grown the Sandwell model from an initial 82 employees to 500 employees, providing a fantastic service that gets a superb report from the users, which is critical. I'll give way to Mark McDonald.
Mark McDonald.
No, the SNP said, let's look at the business case. The business case came back, did not stack up, and therefore it was opposed. It's a great pity that the Labour Party did not join us in opposing that and listen to the very key concerns that were being expressed, not just by politicians, but by trade unions as well.
Yeah, but you see,
Simpson, speaking through
I can
the
say
chair,
to Mr.
please.
McDonald, sorry?
Speaking to the chair, please.
Yes, can I say, Deputy Presiding Officer, to Mark MacDonald, that actually what that illustrates is the confrontational nature between health and social work, for health and local authorities, which is exactly what we've got to get rid of. And if he thinks that the system that's being proposed by the government in their bill is going to do that, I'm afraid he's in for a considerable. He's going to be very, very disappointed. Now, I've said leadership and culture are obviously important, and actually this last part of the discussion actually reflects that. There are two very different cultures here, and marrying them has never thought to be anything other than extremely difficult. But unless we achieve it, then it's going to be really very difficult indeed. Now, the whole thing of accountability is pretty critical. I was disappointed in the fact that John Duncan doesn't think to clear that local democratic control is in any way appropriate. In fact, I just wonder if he believes in local democracy. At least, maybe he does if his party is in charge, but not ours. But I think it is important that there is local democracy involved. Now, we've tried health board elections. And the health board elections, I think, have been expensive, and I'm not sure that they've actually worked particularly well, and I don't think there's been any word of it continuing. Well, democratising the local system through the councillors being in the majority or in control of the CHSCPs will be, I think, a mechanism for democratising health. And what this is about, in my view, is absolutely not about medicalising social care, but actually socialising medical care. And that reflects what Duncan McNeill was saying. We have individuals who are where we need their care to be fully integrated. So in conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, we will vote for the motion tonight if they don't accept our amendment. And we will do so because we agree with the principles, and we will work with the government. But we do disagree on the question of joint and equal accountability. There is a need for single democratic accountability, and we will continue to argue that case.
Many thanks. And I now call on Alec Neil to wind up the debate. Mr Neil, you have until 4:58, so 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. As this is my own production, I'll try to be as loquacious as possible. Can I, first of all, just say and just point out that this is not actually new. There are successes in integration in Scotland. I've used many times the example of West Lothian. The West Lothian integration project has been running very successfully for 8 years. It started off as the integration of adult health and social care. It then incorporated children's services, and it's now quite rightly incorporating acute services. So very clearly we can see from the West Lothian example that it can be done, and many of the problems that have been identified are not necessarily endemic in every local authority area across the country. West Lothian is not the only area in Scotland to have done this successfully. I was up in Turriff and visited Turriff Hospital on Monday. And as Nanette Milne will be very much aware, in Turriff Hospital, that is a totally integrated operation with a health centre, a hospital. The social care workers from the local authority literally work side by side in Turriff Health Centre, along with the health workers. Aileen MacLeod mentioned what happens in the Dumfries and Galloway area. So we do have very good examples of very successful integration across Scotland, as well as indeed down south. And actually, we've also seen that where there is successful integration, we achieve the outcomes that we're trying to achieve as a result of this legislation. Having said that, I do recognise many of the points made very fairly by Ian Gray. And that's precisely why we need legislation. It's precisely why in the bill I will take reserved powers for either a recalcitrant health board or local authority to make sure that it happens, including powers, if necessary, in relation to budgets and other matters, because we're not prepared to sit back and allow it not to happen in any part of Scotland. But I think the points raised by Ian Gray are very valid points, and they're obviously based on his own experience and indeed the experience of many of the rest of us in trying to make integration work.
I think Mr Neil makes a very fair point, and if I was to be asked...
Ian Gray.
I think Mr Neil makes a very fair point, and if I was to be asked what was the key mistake we made in 2000-2001, it would have been that we didn't legislate, and I think that we should have, and that's why, as I said, I think this is a real opportunity. But I still think that the legislation should sweep away that negotiation about pooling budgets, because that is the greatest barrier to moving forward.
Cabinet Secretary. Can I just say, without being specific about that, that I am very open to the suggestions from other parties, and particularly somebody like Ian Gray, who as a minister has had direct experience of trying to make integration work, and I'm happy to meet with individual members and talk through some of these issues. Obviously, we have been in sustained negotiation with COSLA and other stakeholders, and we have a Bill Advisory Committee, and I've agreed that any proposals, any amendments will go through the Bill Advisory Committee to make sure we take as many stakeholders with us as we possibly can. But the other parties in here are also stakeholders, and my door is open to suggestions of how we might be able to improve our proposals and improve the bill once it is published. Can I also take...
Richard Simpson. A brief intervention. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The Integrated Resources Framework provides you with the opportunity of looking at the financial situation in a way that Labour didn't have in 2001. So you have a great advantage in looking at those budgets in an integrated form and comparing them from different authorities.
Absolutely, and I intend to use that very framework as and when necessary. Actually, the irony is, by having these reserve powers, by doing this in legislation and knowing that legislation is coming, I hope that in itself, in many areas, will force people to work together and reach agreement and not continually wrangle about what are really, at the end of the day, not the most important aspects of this exercise. Can I also, because it has come up in the debate a number of times, Duncan McNeill raised it to begin with, in relation to the national standards, I can confirm that we will be publishing a consultation paper on the national standards prior to the publication and the introduction of the bill. I do absolutely accept the point that the national standards are a vital part, a vital linchpin of the success of what we're trying to achieve here, as indeed are the outcomes that we've included in our response to the responses.
Thank you. Will the consultation be completed and the national care standards be put in place in order to inform those people who are setting the outcomes? It would seem that would be a natural process.
Cabinet Secretary. We'll synchronise the standards, the outcomes, and all the other decisions together to make sure there is a logical flow to those decisions. Obviously, I would anticipate it will be well after the summer recess before the bill gets properly into committee, and by that time I would have hoped to have reached decisions on the national standards and have agreement on those. We've already indicated the high-level outcomes we expect, and indeed it must ensure that we get from the integrated partnerships, and that's absolutely right. Now, can I also say that in terms of some of the other points raised, I do share some concerns about the Alio situation in Aberdeen, and I think it's fair to put that on record. I'm not getting into the internal politics of it in Aberdeen. I also do not accept that it would be right to have a majority of local authority representation on the committee. The reasons given for this were it would make it more democratic. Believe you me, and I'm not making a party political point, but some of the practices in the area I represent in North Lanarkshire Council are anything but democratic, and I don't think that I'm going to concede on the principle of equal, and I'll do it this time, I'll keep my promise to you, Jackie, equal representation between the Health Board and the local authority. I should have said presiding officer, I will keep my promise to Jackie Bailey, which I now do.
Thank you. Can I just remind all members you should refer to other members by their full name? Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I indicate that this will be the first time the Cabinet Secretary has kept a promise to me? Can I, however, ask him to specifically exclude executive directors from the new bodies?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, my view is in terms of the Health Board representation, it will be up to each Health Board and the Board being primarily the non-executives who will be the representatives on this body. I do not believe it would be right to have the executives of the Health Board as members of the board of the partnership, because I believe the Health Board needs to use two things. Number one, in principle, I don't think it's the right thing to do. But number two, the Health Board, I think, will be using, and most of them have done this, use the places they have in the committee, not just to ensure they have non-executive directors there, but also, in particular, have patient representatives on the board. And I want to see some end users on the board, because there's nobody better, actually, to drive the standards up than the people who are actually using the services. And therefore, I believe that that will be crucial. Now, let me say, I do think there is an issue here, and we're still in the discussion about this with COSLA and other stakeholders in the third sector and the independent sector. I think we've got to be clear about two separate things. And let me say there's a precedence for this, because when I was convener of the Enterprise Committee and Jack McConnell, now Lord McConnell, was the Minister for Education, we had the crisis at the SQA. One of the reasons the SQA got into crisis was because its board was not made up of people primarily there to run the organisation in terms of what the organisation needed at that time. They were there actually representing their own interests on the board of the SQA. And I suggested, and Jack McConnell accepted, we needed to separate out the two functions. The function of management, of running the organisation, and that should be a fairly tight, reasonably small and manageable management board. And there's a separate issue of how you involve the stakeholders, of whom there are tens, if not hundreds of stakeholders in each area who want an input into service design and delivery, service architecture, and so on, and so they should have. So what I'm saying to people is there has to be, in terms of the management board itself has to be of a manageable size, so that it manages the organisation, looks after the money, makes sure the outcomes are being achieved. And that is not necessarily the same as a wide-ranging stakeholder group for which there is a role as well. And it's getting those two things right in each area is going to be important. And let me also say, I think there will have to be a very close relationship between the partnership boards and the community planning partnerships. And the logical place for the board to report into locally will be the community planning partnerships. because it's round that table all the other relevant services will be represented. Someone quite rightly made the point earlier that we need better involvement of housing services, both council housing services and housing associations. They will be much more involved in the community planning partnership, and that's a logical platform. Once they've been reformed by my friend Mr Swinney, that is a logical platform through which the partnership boards should report to the wider stakeholders and the wider community. And let me also deal finally with the issue of culture. I've heard it said many times there are two cultures. There's a local authority culture and there's a health board culture. I think that's a gross underestimate. Within each health board there are many cultures. There is the culture of the GP. There is the culture of almost each individual allied professional organisation. There is the culture of secondary care. And in the local authority, I can tell you in North Lanarkshire there's a lot of subcultures as a good example of the cultural issue. But the point about we've got to develop one culture, one organisation, one integration, one delivery, one set of budgets for each area, and therefore one set of outcomes and standards, and hopefully one big success in each area delivering for the people of Scotland.
That concludes the debate on the integration of adult health and social care. Dr Simpson, a point of order.
Presiding Officer, on a point of order. I refer to Standing Order 7.3 and to your comments on the 5th of February and on the 28th of February this year. In particular, the advice offered on the 28th, and I quote, "I expect any major policy announcements by the Scottish Government always to be made to the Parliament in the first instance." I regret another point of order has had to be raised in the Parliament because significant policy changes have in the first instance once again appeared in various press outlets rather than in this chamber. A consistent pattern of policy announcements emerging in the press rather than to this Parliament continues to be common practice for the Scottish Government. I refer to the fact that the waiting time target of 98% for patients waiting no more than 4 hours to be seen in accident and emergency is now to be changed and lowered to 95%, and this appears to have been leaked to the Evening News this Monday. This issue was further confused yesterday when the Cabinet Secretary, in a point of order, said that 98% would remain as the standard, but 95% would be a target. So there is total confusion as to the difference between a standard and a target. This is a fundamental change in policy. Further, the £50 million Accident and Emergency Action Fund also appeared in various press outlets. It cannot be right that press outlets are leaked or given such policy information before this Parliament is. These matters are too important not to be heard in this chamber first. This matter is of great importance to the Parliament, Presiding Officer. Announcements rather than first appearing in the press should always in the first instance be made to the Parliament. Can I conclude by Presiding Officer by saying, can you advise me what action you are able to take in order to prevent any further significant policy announcements appearing in the press before they have been discussed or announced in the chamber of this Parliament? Or whether at this point we have reached the point where we seriously need to discuss giving you additional powers if this government continues to ignore your admonitions.
I thank the member for his advance notice of this point of order. As the member says, I have referred to the Good Practice Guide on announcements by the Scottish Government on previous occasions. All members will be aware that the guidance states that major policy announcements should, in the first instance, always be made to the Parliament. However, as the guidance acknowledges, decisions on whether and how to make announcements to Parliament on government business are a matter for the Scottish Government. It will, of course, be for the Scottish Government to reflect on the debate in the Parliament yesterday and for members to use the channels available to them on any of the issues raised during that debate. And can I say, on the issue of additional powers, it is not for me to assume powers for the presiding officer. This is a matter for the Parliament and for its committees. The next item of business is consideration of motion number 5852 in the name of Fergus Ewing on the UK Government amendment to the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Bill UK legislation. I call on John Swinney to move the motion.
Moved.
Thank you. The question on this motion will be put to decision time. The next item of business is consideration of motion number 5731 in the name of Fergus Ewing on the public bodies, the Office of Fair Trading, transfer of consumer advice scheme function and modification of enforcement functions, Order 2013 UK legislation. I call on John Swinney to move the motion.
Move, President Officer.
The question, the motion will be put to decision time. The next item of business is consideration of a Parliamentary Bureau motion. I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move the motion 5851 on substitution on committees.
Formally moved.
The question on this motion will be put to decision time. There are 5 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that amendment number 5831.1 in the name of Jackie Bailey, which seeks to amend motion number 5838 in the name of Alex Neil on integration of adult health and social care be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 5838.1 in the name of Jackie Bailey is as follows. Yes, 41. No, 73. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5838 in the name of Alex Neil on integration of adult health and social care be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5852 in the name of Fergus Ewing on the UK Government amendment to the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Bill UK legislation be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5731 in the name of Fergus Ewing on the public bodies, the Office of Fair Trading transfer of consumer advice scheme function and modification of enforcement functions Order 2013 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5851 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on substitution on committees be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. I now close the meeting.